Hey, Kate.
Hey,
How are you doing?
a little freaked out. I can't believe the semester's almost over.
Yeah, it's gone so fast, hasn't it?
Yeah,
What did you do to your hand?
I don't know.
Oh no, is it like just kind of a like wrist kind of thing or?
Yeah, I've had problems with my left wrist for like years, but I literally woke up this morning and it felt like I had sprained it.
Oh wow.
So I don't know if I just like accidentally punched the wall in the middle of the night or what happened, but
Maybe. Yeah, this time of
so
year
fun.
those things happen, eh?
Hmm.
Hey Peter.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing okay.
Right
Tired.
on. Yeah, I know. It's going around. Everyone is a little bit strung out right now, I think.
Yeah.
Were you able to get the group thing together, or is that still a work in progress?
Actually, let me check if they added anything to our PowerPoint because I made all my voiceovers.
Okay.
So let me just check.
Yeah, it's always a bit of a scramble near the end to pull those together.
Oh, yeah, yep, the group members did add theirs.
Nice.
Oh,
It's
perfect.
a pleasant surprise, eh? That's great.
Yes.
Well, I'm happy for you.
Thank you.
Hey, Saras.
Sorry, I just come now and I said that Peter said, I saw Peter said one of our group members because now I didn't get my phone check about our group, but I did my part. So that's it.
Yeah, and has your group submitted their project, do you know yet, Saras, or are they still working on it today?
No, we want to work on it because some of our groups didn't complete their parts and
Yes.
maybe today after 5:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. Well, hey, if you get it in today, that's what counts. That's great.
Yep. I just noticed that our group members didn't do their voiceovers yet. So Sarah and I did. So we just have to wait for their voiceovers.
Super, super. Well, that's good. There's still time. So that's great.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay. Well, hey, that's for the folks on this call. How about your group, Kate? Did things come together or?
I'll let you be the judge of that.
Touche. But something got submitted, it sounds like. So that's good. Right on. Very cool. Okay. Well, listen, we might have a few more folks jump on the call, but I will get started. And I just want to say for the people who are on the call, obviously there's not many of us, but I really apologize for all the schedule shifting in terms of the lectures. It's been a really, really weird semester that way. And next week I'm at a convention that normally doesn't happen for 2 more weeks. It's normally in the end of April, and I don't know why they moved it up because they know a bunch of us are college professors and that we're still teaching. So what I was hoping to do was to still try and have a time where we could have some group of students that want to show up, be present. That's where I came up with the Wednesday at noon. Now I just found out yesterday evening that we're in this conference from Wednesday morning on. So what I've decided is, and I know this is going to drive people crazy, is I'm going to actually stick to the normal time on Friday morning. I'm going to have to do it like from my hotel room, but I can do that. I'll bring my laptop and so anyway, I'll send an email out to that effect as well. And I know everyone will be royally confused by this point. But the upshot is next week we'll be at the usual time for our last lecture. We'll be on Friday at 10 a.m. So, and it'll be from the Chateau Fairmont Royal York or whatever the heck that hotel is called in downtown Toronto. So maybe the digs will be a little schwankier. The background will be. So yeah, aside from that, let's jump into this week's lecture where things get weirdly positive, which I know has not really been the case for a lot of this course. We've dealt with a fair amount of heavy stuff. So we're going to change that today. So for week 13, hopefully people can hear and see okay. Keep the chat up there. So last lecture, we left off by kind of looking at this pattern that complex societies tend to fall into, where they get, what once were democratic societies become oligarchic in character. Basically, the decision-making processes go off the rails. All of these crises multiply, social and ecological, and basically then, societies get into trouble over and over again and collapse over and over again. So, really, this is what we call a crisis of oligarchy, right? Where in an oligarchic society, and if you remember from last lecture, I talked about social contradictions. Basically, this means more and more social upheaval, ecological contradictions, as the society eats up more and more resources to try and sustain itself. These twin crises cause the societies to lurch from crisis to crisis. It often involves conflict with neighbors. I mean, we're seeing this right now in the world, on the world stage, right? So, what's happening in Ukraine, we have to understand is part of a global geopolitical struggle between the United States, Russia, and China, and their various allies, right? It's something you don't often hear in the mainstream media, which is unfortunate, but anyone who studies these things, they know that's exactly what's going on, right? And so, there's no good guys in that struggle, in the sense of some sort of tidy, clean narrative, right, of who's good and who's bad. These are, powerful countries struggling for resources, right? Struggling for control, over territory. And so basically, this is what you see in oligarchic civilizations. So conflict with neighbors, internal rebellions, which often break out in oligarchic societies. And what starts to happen is the value consensus between the rulers and the ruled starts to break down. So last class, I mentioned this whole idea of false consciousness. Yeah, everything after the midterm, Saris, for the exam. False consciousness, if you remember from the last lecture, is where regular people, mistakenly believe that the super rich and powerful that run the show, they mistakenly believe that those super rich, powerful people actually care about regular day-to-day people, right? Well, that starts to break down when societies hit this point of crisis. And when things start to break down, you start to see governments use more coercion. And we're just seeing this right now in Russia, right? Where there's been a big anti-war presence, a big anti-war movement, which historically speaking has not been the case in Russia. It's a very hopeful thing, I personally think. And yet what's happening is, of course, Putin is cracking down. He's arresting thousands of people, and really becoming authoritarian at home. And we have to remember, folks, this is exactly what happened in the United States when they invaded Iraq, right? You had, hundreds of thousands of people, even millions of people marching around the world to try and prevent that war. You had peace activists in the United States jailed, beaten, whatever. And this is where I said earlier, folks, it's hard to point to any one of these powerful countries and say, oh, here's the good guys, here's the bad guys. They tend to do exactly the same things in these circumstances. So we're seeing it right now in Russia, where coercion becomes more widespread. And what happens if this crisis intensifies is that oligarchic societies actually get close to where they can be overthrown, right? Or where they become destabilized. So, the situation in Ukraine is an example of this. Also right now, recently, I should say, in Canada, we had these protests that were taking place in Ottawa and also in Alberta, in Windsor, where truckers were blocking, border crossings. And, this is a complex situation. There was a lot going on. I think there was a lot of just general anger and dissatisfaction with COVID mandates. However, there were also elements of these protests that were trying to do a lot more. They were, in their mind, trying to overthrow the Trudeau government. There were some far right elements involved. There's very complex sort of situation. But it's an example of what happens, folks, when the value consensus breaks down, when regular people start being like, I don't think the government really cares about us at all, or I think the government is actively hostile towards us and our interests. And of course, by government, most people really, the missing party there that they don't often think about are the large corporate interests that generally are influencing government, right? So, value consensus, when it starts to break down, you start getting more upheaval, instability, conflict, right? And so in response to these crises of oligarchy, the oligarchic class tends to respond in one of two ways. One is reformism. So this is where you'll get a segment of the oligarchic class, the controlling class, that goes, whoa, okay, things are getting out of control. We better give the people some concessions, right? And so this strategy is really the idea of like, let's try and preserve as much of our wealth and power by giving up a little bit to the regular folks, to the masses kind of thing, right? To kind of keep them complacent, okay? So that's sort of a reformist strategy by which the people in power try and stay in power. But another strategy that's often used too is an authoritarian strategy. And this is where the people in power are like, you know what? We're not going to give up anything. We're instead going to crack down on the people that are protesting or that are demanding a more equitable distribution of resources, a more democratic system, whatever it is that regular people are sort of rising up about. Another segment of the ruling class tends to want to come down like a hammer, right? They want to jail people. They want to, assault them with riot policing, you name it, that sort of stuff. And so, at the end of the day, the authoritarian strategy is about expanding their capacity for domination, more police, more people in jail, that sort of thing. And between these two strategies, the problem is it often gives little political choice for regular people, right? Because it's almost like, if you look at the political systems in most of our countries, they tend to be controlled by powerful interests, to a lesser or greater degree based on the party, right? So I'm not trying to say they're all the same. That would be inaccurate. But on the big questions, they're pretty damn similar, right? And so the problem is that for a lot of just regular folks who want real change, they don't know where to turn because it's almost like you're picking two versions of the same poison. So we recently saw this in the United States, where you had an electoral contest between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And, again, I'm not suggesting there's no difference between these two candidates. There clearly was, right? I mean, Donald Trump was definitely from the more sort of authoritarian mold of running the country, cracking down on political dissent, taking a really harsh position in terms of immigration at the border and whatnot. Joe Biden surely, when he campaigned, presented a different perspective that he was going to do more things for sort of regular working class people. And so you have more of a sort of a reformist authoritarian split here. However, when the American people actually, I think I would have, full disclosure, if I was in the States, folks, I'm not a Joe Biden fan. I would have voted for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, right? Just to be for what that's worth, right? And if just my own take on it. Having said that, when Joe Biden got in, like very, very little to almost nothing has happened, in terms of all the things that regular people want in the United States. They want a $15 minimum wage. They want public health care for everyone. They want free college tuition. None of those things are going to happen under Biden as well. What about all the Americans? And there are many Americans, we have to remember this, who don't want their countries involved in foreign wars. They don't want constant instability in the world system. They wish that the United States and NATO weren't always trying to overthrow regimes all over the world. Who can they vote for, right? Because they're going to get that with a Trump or a Biden. The American military industrial complex is just going to do what it does, right? And there has been no demonstrated ability for a political party or a president in the United States to rein that in. Maybe the closest would be John F. Kennedy anyway, we know what happened to him. So let me just say it's difficult. It's very difficult for a president to rein in those basic things. So the point I'm making here, folks, is that it gets really tough as a regular person in the United States trying to do your democratic duty and be like, okay, let's choose a government that actually wants to do what we want them to do. You're looking at, it's like two sides of the same coin, right? It gets very frustrating for people, you know, and even in Canada, where you might say there's even a more stark difference between someone like Trudeau and someone like Aaron O'Toole, between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And these tend to be the two powerful parties that trade government back and forth. I mean, obviously we have the NDP, we have the Green Party, and they are considerably different from the two main parties. But the two main parties, I mean, you know, there are some differences, but again, on the big issues, you know, Canada is going to continue pumping tar sands oil. You know, we're going to continue being one of the worst greenhouse gas emitters on the planet. We're going to continue our membership and support in NATO. We're going to continue to support whatever war the United States wants to put forward. We're going to continue to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia so they can massacre people in Yemen. Like, we're just going to keep doing those. Like, Trudeau is doing those things. Aaron O'Toole will do those things. So again, this is where it becomes difficult for people to say, like, well, what do I do then? How do I create change, right? And so, you know, this is one of the challenges of oligarchy, is that it's almost like the oligarchic elite tries to sew up both sides of the political spectrum, right? They're like, well, if you're more, if you care more about people or whatnot, you'll go with Justin, right? Because in ways he will do things that are useful, you know, that are better, for instance, than Aaron O'Toole would do. One example is the national childcare strategy that he's rolling out right now. He just did a deal with Doug Ford in Ontario about providing affordable childcare for families, which is great. I'm a huge, huge fan of that. And so that's different from what Aaron O'Toole would do. So there's some difference, but there's not a lot of difference, right, at the end of the day. So, you know, the challenge here, and what I want us to look at this lecture and next lecture, is this whole question of, you know, is this just the way this rolls out? You know, are we fated to repeat this cycle of collapse? And I have to be real, folks, as someone who's an old guy who has seen a few cycles of history, right? Even in my time, what's happening right now in the world, how close we are to World War III between nuclear powers, is depressing. Like, it's, I grew up with this in the Cold War, right? When the US and Russia were basically engaged in a global proxy war, both armed to the teeth. And it was like, it was pretty intense times. To be right back there is a little bit distressing. And again, some people might get really, really fatalistic and say, well, you know what, because that's just what we do. And eventually we're just going to keep doing it until someone pushes a button, and that'll be that, right? So, however, I think we know by now, I don't subscribe to that theory, you know, and so if we're not fated to, if this isn't part of it, like what's baked into our DNA, then how can we change things? How can we actually create a world that is sustainable, that is fair and equitable, that is free? You know, all those good things that I really think, you know, 90% of people on this planet can get behind, right? How do we actually pull that off? How do we change the trajectory, so the direction of our society, away from collapse and towards sustainability? So, you know, to answer these questions, we first have to be real about what we are up against, right? So the crisis we face is very real, and the systems that drive it are very, very, very powerful, right? Large fossil fuel companies have a lot of power. Large retail corporations like Amazon and Walmart have a lot of power. You know, governments and whatnot have a lot of power to enforce their agenda. It's also true that the heat is getting turned up. I mean, figuratively and literally. We know that from a climate change perspective, the heat literally is getting turned up. The global temperature is rising to, you know, to dangerous levels. But just the heat politically as well is getting turned up, in the sense that, you know, we can't just keep going the way we're going for decades, right? We're going to hit a wall. collapse is very possible. And in fact, and I've mentioned this before, and folks, I haven't included a lot of these voices because they're too bleak, but there are a lot of scientists that study this that are already like, peace out, we're done. And they're just talking about how to cope with the emotional trauma of collapse, right? Again, I don't agree with that, but I understand why they think that way. And we have to be aware that there are a lot of people, very serious people who study this stuff for a living, who are like, we're done, you know. I don't think that. However, you know, what these people are missing, and this is where maybe because I have a different background, I've studied social movements all my life. The people who think we're totally done, you know, that there's nothing to be done, they really ignore a very important lesson of human history. Yes, there's a whole lot of war and there's a whole lot of destruction and there's a whole lot of bad decisions throughout human history, but also there is a whole lot of change. And in fact, you look at it from a certain perspective, and I would argue that change is simply what we do. It's as human beings, like we are capable of making tremendous changes in our society, and we have done in the past. You know, so what I want to do for a little bit here is just touch on a few instances of massive change that's happened in the past that should give us hope for our ability to change again in the future. So I'll start with, I think I remember mentioning this in a previous class. I'll start with, you know, we're going back a little bit of time here, going back a couple hundred years, but to the most powerful, wealthy economy on the planet. You know, in 1790, the Atlantic slave trade was the most lucrative economy in the world. And Britain, so Britain was the imperial power of the time, was its largest participant, you know, so, you know, this horrendous practice of capturing African citizens, taking them to other countries, you know, to work on plantations and whatnot. That whole slave trade, that was the best way to make money, as horrible as it sounds at that time, 1790, right? However, just 17 years later, England had completely outlawed the slave trade. So in 17 years, the largest, most lucrative economy in the world. And you got to think, so who's participating in that? All the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world are making money selling human beings, right? Horrible state of affairs. Yet in 17 years, it's completely outlawed. Well, who do you think was against that? Every rich person, every powerful person in the country was against it. And yet it was incredible, this movement that emerged to abolish the slave trade in England and how it was so successful. You know, and it's an amazing story. I mean, if you ever have the time to look into it, I wish you know, I could do a whole lecture on it. But it was this amazing movement of, you know, former freed slaves and, you know, deeply religious people who were basically like, this is where in the Bible does it say go forth and enslave your brothers and sisters, right? Like, there was this amazing connection of different kinds of people and a few politicians who were very ethical and honorable, and even a few wealthy people who were ethical and honorable, and they all formed this amazing network. And they pulled it off. They managed to stop this. Of course, it stopped in England in 1807. It continued in other parts of the world for another, you know, couple of decades. It was a long battle to finally get it stopped, but it did. So pretty incredible. Another thing as well we have to think of is that even though the environment right now is in a really bad state of affairs, it wasn't that long ago that nobody taught, like, the environment simply wasn't a thing. People didn't think about it. People didn't talk about it. People sure as heck didn't worry about it. It was literally not on people's tongues. It was not in their minds, right? And it really wasn't until the late 1960s that anyone in North America cared at all about the environment, right? So again, we might say, all right, late 60s, you know, come on, it's been like 50 years, let's get our act together. But still 50 years in the grand scope of things is not that long. And if you think about it today, or actually, sorry, I'm saying 60 years, which I guess is a little more accurate. You simply can't escape discussions of the environment. It's on the news. People are talking about it all the time. People are debating it. It's front of every political party's platform. Even if in a lot of cases, like if you think of the conservatives and liberals, a lot of times they'll talk a lot about the environment and climate change, but they really don't want to do a lot about it. But they can't avoid talking about it. And some things are changing. Some things are getting better that way when it comes to the environment, whether it's conservation, preserving forests, action on climate change. A lot of countries, folks, are doing great work on climate change, right? Just sadly, we're not in one of those countries, right? Canada or the United States. But it's important to remember that actually there's been a heck of a lot of a shift. There's been a lot of change that's happened around the environment too. Another really important instance of change that, again, it's easy for people today to not fully appreciate just how big this was, is that, in Canada, in, say maybe 1915 or whatnot, if you're a woman, like you literally could not participate in the political process at all. You literally weren't allowed to, right? So in the early 1900s in North America, women couldn't vote. Black people and white people were segregated. LGBTQ people had zero rights. You could be immediately fired if someone found out you were gay. You could probably be beaten with zero consequence, right? Like it's hard to, think about this, but this wasn't that long ago, really, for some of us, our grandparents even remember this kind of world. Where this was simply the case, right? Huge chunks of our society had no rights whatsoever, right? Which was, again, a horrible state of affairs. And if you look at today, I mean, this is massive, massive change that's happened, right? In less than 100 years, all of a sudden you have rights for all of these different groups, civil rights, equal protection and opportunity under law for women, for minority groups, for LGBTQ folks. And again, I am not trying to say that there are no issues anymore around equity in Canada or in the United States or Europe or other countries like that. Yes, there are. However, we can't kid ourselves that there hasn't been tremendous change. I would argue tremendously positive change, right? In that these rights are being extended, really, which I would agree to everyone they should be extended to, right? We're seeing it play out right now in Canada around trans rights, right? And, of course, it's been controversial. It's led to lots of, debates and whatnot. And yet, really, at the end of the day, to just not support basic rights for everybody, I think it's a position it's a failed position. It's not going to win. And so, of course, trans people need their rights. Of course, they shouldn't be discriminated against. I mean, it just makes basic sense, right? Every single human being should be entitled to these rights. And folks, we've made amazing progress towards that. So that is really, really hopeful. We can't lose sight of that. Also, as well, we can't lose sight of the fact that even though there's still a lot of economic problems in our countries, things are quite a bit different than they were in the early 1900s, where just like a whole bunch of people had no rights, like women and visible minorities, working people had almost no rights as well in North America in the early 1900s. Wages were like completely low, like you could basically just barely survive, right? There was no such thing as weekends and health and safety laws and minimum wages, and none of that stuff existed, right? And it basically took 40 years of intense organizing by labor unions, just sort of working class people getting together, forming political organizations. And what that led to was, labor laws, higher wages, benefits, social welfare, pensions, like all of these things did not exist. Even the fact that there's a government pension, that there's employment insurance if you lose your job, folks, none of those things were given to people by the people in power. And this is an important thing for us to understand, because you'll never read that, generally speaking, in the standard history books, right? Or the standard account of like, oh, how does Canada have a healthcare system? Well, because people fought like hell for it, right? Regular people, not rich people, not the people in power. In fact, not even doctors who threatened to go on strike, which I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So folks, changes happen. Change can happen. We have to remember that, okay? So the big question now I want to talk about for rest of this lecture and next lecture is, okay, let's talk about how this can happen then, right? I mean, there are a lot of folks on this call who are going to live long lives and who are going to be confronting these problems and these challenges. So what the heck can be done moving forward, right? Well, you've probably already heard me sort of say this, and because I've hinted at it before, but history teaches us what I call an ironclad lesson. And that is that the concessions that we want, the things that we want, they're never given by people in power of their own volition, just because they're nice people, right? What basically has to happen is people always have to take power from elites, right? We have to force concessions to improve social welfare, justice, equality, and environmental protection. And in fact, that's always how it's been, right? You know, and the secret is this concept that I talked about in previous lectures, power with. And power with is basically challenging oligarchy with democracy, you know, bringing more people into the fold of making decisions, having their voices heard, having their humanity respected. That's how it happens. And a lot of times it's pretty intense, right? You know, so this picture right here from the civil rights movement in the United States, you know, in the late 50s, this is what it was. This is what it looked like. It looked like Black Americans having to fight to simply exist, to simply sit down at a lunch counter, to walk down a street, right? In the face of like literally being attacked by dogs, fire hoses, getting beaten with batons and whatnot. I mean, this is what it took. And trust me, I think it's horrible that it took this. I'm in no way saying this is good. It's not. But it is a harsh lesson for us to understand, is that, you know what, if we can get easy change, folks, I say we take it all day long, but it tends not to work that way. It tends to be a bit of a struggle, right? You know, Black people had to do this, women had to do this, queer people had to do this, working class people had to do this, and environmentalists today are having to do the same thing, right? It is a struggle. So when we think about what we have to do, you know, to really change our trajectory, the trajectory of our civilization away from collapse towards sustainability, you know, there's some big things we need to do. You know, we need to end constant growth consumer economies. I mean, there is no debate about this anymore. If you talk to any serious ecologist, they're like, yeah, we literally can't keep constantly expanding on a finite planet. Hopefully when we talk about overshoot, everyone understands that now. We're talking about basic laws of physics here. And so we simply have to stop that. We've got to envision different economies where zero growth is okay, you know, and where things still function, right? That's a big change. We have to drastically reduce inequality. I mean, within countries and especially globally too, right? There is this massive disparity in wealth between rich and poor nations and between rich and poor within individual countries. We need to move to a post-carbon economy. We literally need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. That is a huge challenge because, of course, not only does our entire society run on fossil fuels, but it is still, it's liquid gold, right? Or, you know, gold in the form of coal or whatever, right? Or gas, but it is extremely lucrative. So you have people making tons of money on fossil fuels. They have zero interest in keeping any of it in the ground. They have every interest in burning every last little bit of it, which we know would be disaster. So that's a big thing too, right? How about ending the war economy, ending imperialism, you know, facing down the military industrial complex in the United States and also as it exists in Canada. I mean, Trudeau just announced they're going to radically increase Canada's military budget. Why? Well, because we're throwing in with the United States and NATO in this, you know, standoff between three global powers, right? I don't know, maybe Canada should be a country calling for sanity and de-escalation and whatnot. Well, we're not. So how do we change that, right? difficult. How do we protect the rights of all citizens? How do we ensure that everyone is given due process, is free to speak their mind, all that sort of stuff. Very, very important stuff. And if anything, I would argue that these are radical changes, right? But I want us to think about that word, because I don't mean about like running into the streets and burning things and yelling goofy slogans and stuff like that. Like that's, I know a lot of times we hear radical, we think people who are just like, oh, wow, stop shouting. Like you're driving me crazy. I mean radical in its dictionary definition, which is to get to the root of, right? That's what radical means. So yeah, we need change that gets to the root of the problem. Definitely. So in that sense, we need radical change. It's partly why I named my book Radical Transformation, right? And so given the fact that we need to make some significant changes, we then have to think about, okay, well then how does the system of power function? How do you pull off serious change in societies like ours? Well, you've got to confront this whole idea that to a large extent, power in our societies is hegemonic, right? And, to recall this, because this was a lecture that I know I wasn't able to do live, I posted it, so maybe some folks haven't watched it. Hegemonic power is a form of power in which a lot of people kind of think that the rulers are legitimate, that they actually share their interests, right? And so a lot of people think that the current system is just like, it's just the way it is, right? Maybe they don't like it, maybe they're not fans of it, but for instance, if you say to someone like, yeah, like we can't have constant growth consumer economies, they'd be like, you're crazy, that's just the way it is. Like we just produce a bunch of stuff, like it's good. I want my toys, I want my latest fashion, I want my new car, like I just want that stuff, So people, to a certain extent, have bought into the system. It seemed to be common sense, but also oligarchs rule by appearing legitimate. So they reach out to the masses. It's like, Trump with this whole "Make America Great Again." It's the ultimate idiotic slogan. It's like, well, who wouldn't want America to be great, right? Like, it's like, oh, you don't want America to be great. It's almost meaningless, but it's like his way of saying, oh, I want greatness for you, American people. Even though when he gets in power, one of the only things he's actually able to accomplish is a tax cut for the wealthiest people in corporations, right? So he's literally screwing the working class people in reality. And yet in his messaging, it's all about, I'm one of you, I've got your back. And this is how hegemonic power works, right? So it's tricky, right? We have to deal with this idea that a lot of people, this system, that when you analyze it, you go, whoa, there's big problems. This is falling apart. That's falling apart. This is heading towards a cliff. But if people don't see that, and instead they're like, oh, this seems to work okay to me, then you have to thread a needle. You have to be radical, but also reasonable in how you're perceived by people, in how you speak to people, right? And there's a reason why I've got a picture of Bernie Sanders here, because I think in the United States anyway, he was an example of someone who was able to do that. Like he was actually talking about radical things, he was talking about a $15 minimum wage. He's talking about free college education. He's talking about healthcare for all Americans. Right now in the United States, those are considered radical. In other countries, they're not. Other countries have already done them like decades ago. But in the States, they were considered radical. But the way that Bernie was able to deliver that message, he was very, very popular, Yeah, they do, because Bernie calls himself a democratic socialist. So of course, in the United States, they always, as soon as someone uses the word socialist, they try and say like, he's a fan of Stalin and gulags and all that sort of stuff like that. They tried that with Bernie, but it never quite stuck, because he would talk to people like they were regular people, and he would say things that made sense to people, right? And so he was an interesting example. Not to say that I agree with everything Bernie Sanders ever said or did or whatnot, or I don't think he's a perfect politician. I'm not trying to say that, but he's an interesting example of how even these radical ideas, if you just speak plainly to people and are like, yeah, like why shouldn't you get public health care? Most Americans are like, you're right. There's no good reason. It's easy to forget this about the States. Sometimes that country can appear a little bit nuts, but there's a lot of very reasonable people there. They've wanted these things for generations, right? And we also have to remember too, Bernie came very close to being the president of that entire country. So it's not like these views aren't popular, right? So anyway, just an interesting example of how this can work. You need to communicate to be understood. You can't always be constantly shaming people and putting them down, right? Like that doesn't work. You can't always be yelling at people. That doesn't work, right? Like, but if you're perceived as reasonable and having people's interests, if you appear legitimate to people, you can actually get stuff done. It's actually, you know, it's pretty exciting how much you can get done. And the idea here is that, you know, human beings are very diverse. We have different interests, you know, and that's fine. That's part of who we are as human beings, right? However, there's that 80% that you think that most of us would share. Like, hey, should we not all blow up in a nuclear war? Yeah, you're going to get, I'd say maybe even more than 80%, but let's just say 80%. You're going to be like, yeah, okay, that's a good idea. Hey, should we maybe not all roast in, you know, 60 or 80 years through runaway climate change? Yeah, 80% of people are gonna be like, okay, that makes sense. So it's speaking to that 80% and not constantly hammering away at the 20% that divides us, right? On these sorts of culture war issues, these ridiculous things about, you know, was Will Smith right to slap Chris Rock or not? Like, this stuff is meaningless, right? And so smart politicians who want to get things done, and not just smart politicians, but smart activists and researchers and scientists and public intellectuals, they realize, yeah, sometimes you got to say some hard stuff. Sometimes you have to let people know we need to change. But if you do it in a reasonable way, in a respectful way, that you can actually get a lot of work done. So that's one lesson I think that we can learn from how change works. You know, another one is that in order to shift the power structure, we kind of have to play the game of hegemony. And this is where, you know, we talk about counter hegemony, which is like, how do you oppose that system of power that a lot of people think is legitimate? Well, partly then what you need to do is you need to delegitimize that oligarchic system. You know, we need to point out the deception, the illogic, the self-interest of the rulers and the elites, right? That is important. It's almost like, to a certain extent, you got to help people have the veil taken off their eyes and help them see, like, oh yeah, like, you know, for instance, like Donald Trump, he was brilliant at holding these massive rallies and speaking to average Americans like he was their best bud. And I know a lot of average Americans would be like, well, who would I rather have a beer with? Donald Trump or Joe Biden? And of course, and I hate to say it, I would probably even say Donald Trump too, just because it would be such a weird, like fun kind of yet horrifying experience. And Biden would probably just fall asleep or something like that, right? So I get it. Like, Trump had that appeal. But again, it's like helping people understand, well, what did he do when he got in power? He literally cut taxes on the richest people in the country, and he did nothing for average people. And the more people sort of hear that, then hopefully they can be like, oh, wait a second. Okay, so maybe there's something else going on here, right? That's important. But the other thing too, and this gets to my previous slide, is you need to speak from a place of cultural legitimacy, right? So you can't be perceived as someone just being like, burn it all down, right? Like, if that's your message, you're not going to get very far, because a lot of people are going to be like, you sound like a lunatic. Why would I believe you, right? However, if people desiring change center themselves in the most foundational values of society, that's powerful. But more than it just being powerful, it's also truthful, because you know, I would argue that the people trying to make these changes really are the ones that care about democracy, about fairness, about human rights, about environmental stewardship. Like, these are basic values that I think more than 80%, I think 90% of us share these values, right? And so if you're going to say some harsh things sometimes against the people in power, or if you're going to sometimes have to talk about some depressing things with people, right? In the sense of we got to change things. If you center yourself in these values, then it's a very, very powerful and very, very productive thing. And I'm going to give you an example of a group that was just brilliant at this over this is like the last 5 years. This big struggle has been playing out. And there's a picture here. And this is a young child from the Standing Rock Sioux. So they are a native nation in it was North Dakota, I believe. And they are protesting in this picture, the Dakota DAPL's, the Dakota Access Pipeline. So this is massive pipeline that's traversing across the United States. And it was passing through the land of the Standing Rock Sioux. And the Standing Rock Sioux were like, there's this huge river, right, which feeds our community, not just our clean water, but also we fish from it. It's literally our life. And we know that pipelines, as they cross rivers, it's just a matter of time before there's a leak. And it literally is the case. It's something that the oil industry never wants people to understand, is that pipeline leaks and tanker leaks aren't like, oh, crazy. Oh, how did this happen? They happen all the time. Like, it's just part of the science is not great yet. In pipelines, you've got super, super, super pressurized oil. It has to be super pressurized in order to move over vast distances. And because it's super pressurized, those things blow, right? And when they do, that oil spills into whatever watershed is there. It happens all the time. So the Standing Rock Sioux were like, you know what? We don't want this. We don't want this crossing our river. We don't want the danger of it, the damage of it. So what they did, which was quite brilliant, is they were like, okay, we're going to fight against this pipeline. We're going to do everything we can. And in doing so, they were very clear. They're like, you know why we're doing this? Because we're water protectors. We think clean water is a good thing, right? And it was quite brilliant because it's pretty hard to argue against that, right? You're like, no, we're for dirty water. We're for polluted watersheds. We're for destroyed ecosystems. Like, really? Good luck, right? And so when they center themselves, again, and this isn't just a PR stunt, it's the truth. This really is what they're all about. They're like, clean water, folks. We think it's important. So they call themselves water protectors. They use nonviolence very, very explicitly. And man, they got everything turned on them. They got the attack dogs, the water cannons, the tear gas, the pepper spray, the plastic bullets. I mean, when you really want to see the authoritarian side of Western governments, see how they treat Native people who protest, right? Because then it's like the gloves are off completely. So these people got beat up like left, right, and center, but they stayed nonviolent the whole way. And they use messages like this. This is like a big protest, defend the sacred, So they're coming at it from the perspective of not just the fact that, as water protectors, they're protecting the environment for all of us, but they're totally coming at it from the perspective that as Native people, this land is sacred as well, right? So this was powerful. It made it really difficult for other groups to attack their motives, right? In fact, they just couldn't, and so that was a victory that they won right off the bat. And then they invited every other Native person literally on the planet to come stand with them. And so they had this amazing situation where you had Native groups from literally all over the world showing up at Standing Rock and standing with these people. But then it started to go beyond that. And this is where things got really exciting. Then you had a whole bunch of non-Native people being like, you know what? Like, this is not okay, what's happening. And at one point, it was like, I'd never seen anything like this. I think it was something like 2,000 US Army veterans went down to the site where this conflict was taking place between all these police and the army and the fossil fuel company trying to build a pipeline and these brave Native folks. These 2,000 US Army veterans went to be human shields between the two groups. How amazing is that? Because they were like, you know what, what's happening is not okay, So they were incredibly successful in this fight. They got the pipeline canceled. And then it started again when Trump got in power. And then they got it canceled again, and then it got started again. So this has been a back and forth struggle, but it's been in ways incredibly successful. When you think about everything they were up against like literally the largest corporations in the country, the army, the police, the politicians, right? And they managed to be incredibly, incredibly successful. And again, I would argue part of it is because they really, how they presented themselves was so legitimate. You could not argue against their motives or their merits, right? So really, at the end of the day, to get this kind of radical transformation, there's two key things you need to do. One is you need to delegitimize the oligarchy. What is that? You just need to tell the truth, right? You just really need to say, like, this is what's actually happening, right? Like, these corporations are making out like bandits by destroying the environment, by, you know, paying their workers pennies, whatever, like whatever it is, right? You just need to tell the truth. That's the delegitimization part. But then you need to build the legitimacy of radical movements. You need to make sure that you're not just, like I said, sounding like you're some lunatic that wants to burn the whole system down. You can't just be sounding like you're, harassing everyone for living an impure life or something like that, right? All these things, like, it just doesn't work that way, right? But if you're able to pull these things off, then you can actually achieve what I'm sort of talking about here and what I talk about in my book, which is a radical transformation. We really can change the direction of our societies away from collapse, away from crisis, and towards, quite a brilliant future. And so in order to do this, there's four key things that, movements need to do and to sort of focus on. And I'm going to talk about examples of these things for the rest of the lecture. So I call them four transformative tasks is the title there. And the first one is education. The next one is solidarity building, then resistance, and finally alternatives building. So I'm going to go through examples of what I mean by each of these, so we can sort of see what I'm talking about and why they've been important in the past. So we'll start with education. I mean, this shouldn't really surprise anyone. I guess as a college professor, I'm going to say education is important, but it's not just me. So, basically part of telling truth to people is we need to give people accurate information. Like it's pretty basic, right? Scientific information, as truthful as possible. And that in and of itself, especially in a society like ours, is a radical thing. To simply just try and be as truthful as possible with people and actually give them good information is very, very radical. Because there are a lot of groups, and again, not just the groups in power, there are a lot of groups all over the place that are really trying to misinform people, trying to spin information, trying to deliberately mislead people. And, so to just try and cut through that is huge. And I want to be clear here, folks. I'm not suggesting that any one person has the gospel truth, me included. However, how science works, how finding truth works is that you need to get everyone's, okay, you throw your truth on the table. Tell me what you think. Throw your evidence on the table. Let's see it, right? Let's debate it. Let's talk about it. Like, that's how we do it as societies. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's how we discover and develop ourselves. And so that's why education is so important. It also involves making sure that all voices are heard, right? So, it's important that we know how things are negatively affecting certain groups of people, especially groups of people whose voices are normally not heard, right? You can't have justice and equity in a fair society if you're simply leaving certain voices out, if you're simply not listening to them. I mean, in Canada for decades, this was the case with First Nations people, right? Where it just like they were just pushed to the margins, right? They're on their reservations. We're not going to talk about the residential schools. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff. We're just not going to hear that voice, right? And clearly, when you're not hearing people's voices, one of the really dangerous things that can happen is that horrendous atrocities can be occurring. And they can occur because most people don't know about them, right? And that's how really horrible things happen. They tend to happen in the shadows. They tend to happen when there isn't the full light of society on them. It's why last year there was such a collective national freakout when they started discovering all those graves at the residential schools. But you know who wasn't shocked and surprised and freaked out? Were the native people of Canada. They were like, yeah, this is what we've been talking about for the past like 100 years, that there's been some horrible things happening, right? So anyway, that's part of it. This is where, again, education, truth telling, folks, it could be uncomfortable. It could be difficult, you know, and you imagine the kind of like, we probably all saw it on our Facebook pages, on our Instagram, on our Twitter, whatever, the conflict, the battles, the back and forth and hurt feelings and accusations that come up when you simply try and express some difficult truth, right? And that's really what was happening in that moment. But it's absolutely necessary. We have to do it. You know, we have to help people understand things like how does your political system actually work? How are decisions actually made? How are issues connected? You know, these different things that we're encountering that may seem disconnected, really, you can trace them back to primary causes. How does change work? I mean, even getting people to understand the message that, you know what, if we want things to change, we're going to have to demand it. We're going to have to organize ourselves. And we're going to have to, you know, we're going to have to push for things to change. We can't just lie back and assume that the people in power are going to do the right thing, right? It's also critically important when it comes to education to promote and defend free speech and to oppose censorship. And I believe very, very strongly in this. And I think that there are, I know there are many people on the left and right who would disagree with me on this, many who would agree with me, but I really think this is absolutely critically important. As someone who believes in science and democracy, you have to be able to speak freely, even if you're saying ridiculous things. You know, if you are saying ridiculous things, it's up to everyone else to show that they're ridiculous and to, you know, to counter your arguments using their own speech. I think it's incredibly important. This involves things like academic freedom, right? The ability to teach as truthfully as you think is possible, right? This is a big deal, especially in Canada today. There are academics actively being fired, being shut down, being censored for speaking truthfully about things. You know, whether it is speaking truthfully about the role that the fossil fuel industry has in funding education in certain Canadian universities, right? There are professors getting in trouble, getting fired for bringing that stuff up. Whether it is professors who are talking about, you know, the realities of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, right? There are people getting fired for that. So academic freedom is a struggle right now in Canada, as is just the freedom for people to speak up about things. You even saw it recently in this situation with the war on Ukraine, you know, where when the invasion first happened, you know, where Russia first invaded, you had a lot of people, and I was one of them, saying that this is Russia has committed a war crime. It's horrible that this invasion should not happen. It needs to end immediately. However, we were also, people who study this stuff are like, 100% NATO is a part of this conflict. 100% they set the table for this and have provoked a conflict that the Ukrainian people are paying for. But folks, to say that meant you got attacked like over and over and over again. Until, of course, now it's obvious that that's what's going on, right? But I mean, in the beginning, when war happens and when your governments start really cranking up the war rhetoric and whatnot, it becomes very difficult to put forward a counter narrative, right? And so that's why free speech is so important, you know, and it doesn't mean you're going to agree with everything you hear, but it's absolutely critical that we have it. And the thing about education, why it's so important, is it starts to help raise awareness of the alternatives as well. So it's like, you know, there are other ways of doing things. There are other ways of being in the world. There are other institutions. There are countries right now on this planet doing amazing things that would solve most of the problems we've talked about in this lecture, right? Or in this course. We've talked about a lot of problems, right? So, you know, and trust me, the rest of this lecture and next lecture, I'm going to get into a bunch of these things, you know, so we see that what hopeful stuff is available. You basically, through education, have to shift people's consciousness. That's kind of what you're doing. That's what happens through education. That's what happens every time I teach a course. Every time I interact with the material and interact with the students, I learn things, and it shifts the way I look at the world, right? It's a very, very important step in the process. Part of this is being exposed to the experiences of others. And this is really important because it helps us expand our empathy. And again, just to use the example of what happened recently in Canada, you know, for a lot of non-native Canadians, like I said, they were freaked right out about this whole idea of like, there are these hundreds of graves of children at these schools. And for the first time, for a lot of people, they actually felt the pain of that, the loss of that, the horror of that, right? Those experiences all of a sudden became real to them. And that helped expand empathy. It helped people to realize like, oh, wow, those children are children too, you know, even though whatever, they're native, they're human beings too, they deserve better, right? That's important. That's where you get this, you know, every child matters kind of thing, you know, messaging and movement that started across Canada. Very important. Hopefully it will lead to actual change in terms of how we deal with Native issues in the country. Another important thing too is that, you know, being exposed to nature, learning about the ecological crisis. These are things that also help shift people's consciousness, that get them thinking more about, oh, wow, we are a part of this whole web of life, this whole incredibly intricate, fragile web of life. That's pretty important. You know, people start, it shifts the way they think about things. And I don't know if people even on the call can relate to this, but, you know, the more time you spend in nature, like whether it's hiking or at a conservation area or kayaking or canoeing or whatever, the more time you spend in nature, the more you're like, wow, nature's pretty cool. Maybe we should save this stuff. Maybe we should not just pave it all, right? So that's important too. Having those direct experiences with other people's voices, with the natural world, these things can help shift people's consciousness. And the other really important thing about education too is that, you know, open debate and quality information, they encourage people to think critically, right? You know, to me, the antidote to like QAnon nonsense is good critical information. And is people willing to sort of take on those silly things and be like, well, here's why that's silly, you know, and hopefully do it in a way where you're not saying that anyone who believes it is a blithering idiot, right? You know, like, again, there's a way to do these things such that you're not tearing people down and attacking them, but instead you're showing why an idea is maybe not a great idea, or why a certain belief is totally unfounded in evidence or whatnot, right? This is critical. I mean, this is what, as societies, we need to be doing. We need this kind of critical debate in order to untangle the mess we're in and get people, you know, supporting progressive alternatives, right? So that's education. Education is pretty important. It's what happens up here, right? You're trying to shift people's thinking about the world, about their place in it. The next important task is solidarity building. And this is a little bit more on the level of like groups of people getting together to seek change, right? This is what, as social scientists, we call social movements. Social movements are when groups of people get together to affect change. Like we talked about the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, right? So really what solidarity building is all about from a radical transformation perspective is we need to build a movement of movements. We need to create a way in which all these different movements can join together. And like I said in a previous slide, join together around that 80% that we share. You know, there's going to be that 20% we disagree on. That's fine. We can debate about that forever. That's what human beings do. But let's try and move forward on that 80%. So it means like, you know, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the movement for equity, right? So for equal rights for people, regardless of their sexuality, their gender, their skin color, you know. The peace movement, the movement trying to end these expansionist imperialist wars. And then the movement for democratic renewal, movement trying to get big money out of politics, the movement trying to make our electoral systems more fair. Like all of these movements are out there, folks. So we may not hear about them as often as it would be good to, But trust me, they're out there. There's a lot of people working very hard on all these issues. However, what needs to happen more is for these groups to start pooling their resources and their efforts, to start realizing how they share commonalities. Again, they share 80%. They don't share 100%, right? Because they each have their own sort of thing that they're looking on. But it's really, really important for these groups to start working together to transform our society. And so, you know, how do we integrate these multiple movements and issues? This is then the question that arises, right? Because as someone who has been involved in studying social movements, but also participating in them for probably like about 30 years now, it's difficult. It tends to be the case that people get focused on their own little issue, and they don't want to hear about others, or, you know, people get trapped in little silos, right? So there's ways to do this, right? So for instance, you know, if you're speaking about your issue, you know, in a way that is universal. So say maybe it's still about equity, but you do it in a universal way, then that helps make it a broader sort of thing. And I have the example here of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And so, you know, when this first started, and I really think you've got to go back to like 2012, really, when this movement actually emerged. And then it really blew up, obviously with the murder of George Floyd, you know, but over those years, there was basically a group of young Black civil rights activists who sort of said, it's very simple, you know, Black Lives Matter, right? And what's kind of sad and a little bit funny is that a lot of people, a lot of white Americans and North Americans sort of said, that's racist, all lives matter, right? And it's like, okay, so it's silly to say that, because actually that's exactly what Black Lives Matter is saying. Like, you know, it's not saying only Black Lives Matter. It's not saying Black Lives Matter, but your life doesn't. It's literally saying all lives matter. And guess what? Obviously, then Black Lives Matter too. So the point I'm trying to get at is that what I saw a few times is and only a few times, unfortunately, because what would tend to happen is someone would post a Black Lives Matter thing. Someone would say, this is on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. Then someone would say, or Twitter, oh, that's racist, all lives matter. And then just a battle would start between the two people, right? Because, you know, the one person would be like, you're an idiot, and you're an idiot, blah, blah. That we all know social media, right? That's what happens. But a few times what I saw, and it really impressed me, I'd like to think I came up with this, folks. I did. I saw other people do it, and I was like, that's smart. I had a few other people, someone would post a Black Lives Matter thing, someone else would be like, well, all lives matter. And a third person would come in and be like, yeah, you're right. And that's exactly what they're saying by saying Black Lives Matter. And they would just like build this bridge, and it was crazy. And the other person would be like, oh, okay, I get it. All right. I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to stop posting nonsense, right? When someone is simply saying, of course, Black Lives Matter too. But that ability to sort of message something, but in a way that is universal is really powerful. It may seem subtle, but it is very, very powerful. So the idea is that, of course, you want rights for whoever, whether it's women or Black people or queer people or trans people. It's because we all should have rights. We all should have equal treatment. Everybody. That means straight white guys. It means straight white women, whatever. It doesn't matter who you are. Everybody should have those rights. And if someone doesn't, we should all be concerned, because it could be us next, right? It's like thinking about things in those ways is important. It helps bring people together and realize, like, oh, it's not just that these groups want special treatment. You know, it's like, no, they want the same damn treatment that everyone should get, right? And so it's important. It's almost like this idea of looking for the win-win, right? So messaging things such that, yeah, we're not just talking about special treatment for certain groups. We're talking about equal treatment for all groups. And then that brings people in who otherwise might feel like they're being attacked by something, by a message. And trust me, I get it, folks. I think it's silly that people feel attacked. For instance, people are talking about women's rights and men feel threatened. I think that's ridiculous. But there's a way to do it still, where it's like, hey, listen, like, what, do you believe in fairness? I mean, what person's going to be like, no, fairness sucks? Like, no one's going to say that, right? So there's a way to have that conversation where you bring them on side with a calm and understanding. And then you just show how, well, that's all this is, right? That's all this is fairness. Yeah, 100%, Michelle. We see it every day. We see it every day. But what's interesting is, I think, hopefully in just having this conversation, we also see that it's not impossible to sidestep that, to step outside of that tendency to just turn into these two warring camps that are fighting against each other. It's difficult, folks. It's not easy, but it's definitely doable. And what's also really interesting too is that there's training for this, right? Like, community organizer training, right? There's activist training that really helps you understand how this works and understand how to sort of pull your emotions out of it, you know what I mean? And just sort of communicate effectively, right? So that's education too, right? So, think about that. In order to build solidarity, we need to help people understand how to do it, right? And how to talk to each other in a way that isn't aggressive and, quote unquote, othering, right? Part of solidarity building, apart from just how we talk with each other, is understanding how issues are interconnected, right? So, and a big one in this, which really drives me up the wall, is how people don't make the connection between war and immigration, right? So, for instance, you have all of these people in, whether it's Canada or the United States. And I remember when we were, there was a number of Syrian refugees coming over. And first of all, there was a lot of, uproar. All the right-wing parties in Canada and the United States, right-wing politicians were always, oh, it's too many, all these Syrians coming in, and oh, their culture's too different, and oh, how will we integrate them, and blah, 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 that sort of stuff. I mean, first of all, I think that's nonsense. But what's fascinating is those are the same parties that tend to be pro-war. And why the heck do you think hundreds of thousands and millions of Syrians all of a sudden decided one day, oh, I want to leave my country? Like, the fact that people don't think of that blows my mind. Most people, folks, shocker, would actually prefer to stay where they grew up, like where everyone speaks their language and they know the culture and all their friends or family are there and they love their country and all. Like, that's generally speaking how it works. However, we live in a world in which in certain countries, life is made intolerable for people, usually because some wealthy country is bombing them into the Stone Age, or someone wants to steal their resources or whatever. Sometimes it's natural disasters and stuff like that. But it's so I think hopefully people can see the contradiction. It's like, listen, so yeah, maybe sometimes it is even a problem. Maybe there's a flood of refugees and you're like, it's too many, right? Your systems can't handle it. Well, then why are you supporting war in that country, right? Which is causing people to do what any reasonable person would do, is like, I don't want to die. I don't want my kids to get blown up. All right, I'm out of here. I'm going to go someplace and try and be safe, right? So not making that connection. And again, it's happening right now in Ukraine. There are millions of refugees pouring out of that country. And yet you still have a situation where NATO and the United States and Canada are trying to extend that conflict, not end it. Why? Because screw you, Russia. Like, pretty much that's what it comes down to. We want to bleed Russia as much as possible in that conflict. That's why, block the peace deals, keep the weapons flowing in. It's horrendous, right? Whereas if people would realize that the best thing for Ukrainians and all those refugees is an immediate end to the war, right? And that doesn't mean that Russia gets everything they want, or Ukraine gets everything they want, or NATO gets everything they want. It means you have an actual negotiation and you do what you hammer out a deal. It happens, right, all the time, and it could happen. And I hope it happens tomorrow. But trust me, there are forces trying to drag that conflict on, and they're not understanding the connection between all of those people being pushed out and the fact that their country is being destroyed, right? Same thing happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, right? You name it. There are a number of refugees coming from Afghanistan now. Why is that, right? Well, because we broke the country, right? Anyway, so we need to we need to combine these things. Another big one is women's rights and population. So a lot of people will talk about, oh, Earth's population is a big problem. And you know what? For the next couple of decades, it will be before it levels out. So sure, population's a problem, but the biggest way to affect population growth is actually to increase the status of women and to reduce poverty, right? Like these are hardcore scientific facts, right? That the more educated women get and the more economically self-sufficient, the less likely they are to have a whole bunch of children. It's just what happens, right? And the other thing too is that the more you reduce poverty, the less poor families feel like they've got to have 10, 12 children because 4 of them are going to die and they need a bunch of them to work and whatnot. I mean, this sounds horrible, folks, but these are the sorts of calculations that people have to make when they're in desperate poverty. So, you know, but again, people don't often make that connection. So a lot of people that really complain about population, folks, from what I've seen, tend to be wealthy white folks living in rich countries. And their whole thing is like, well, we don't have a population problem. It's all of those people, like they're just breeding and blah, blah, you know, over and over again. Like it is actually in a lot of cases pretty blatantly racist. It's also stupid because those are the same people who are supporting policies that keep those countries poor and that keep the status of women low and that reinforce high population rates. So it literally makes no sense. So these sorts of things, right? Having these kinds of conversations, helping people understand the connections between things is also really important. You know, then you start realizing that the environmental movement, right, that wants to keep population low, should be working hand in hand with movements for women's rights to reduce poverty, right? Then you start seeing the natural connections between these different things. You know, groups working for rights for immigrants, very important. They should also be staunchly anti-war, right? Because again, last thing I'll say about this is in the United States, what's their big issue is all of these immigrants coming up from Latin America through Mexico, the Mexican border, into the United States. And yeah, fair enough. Maybe there's a certain level where you're like, it's just too many immigrants. You know, I'm not sure they've met that, but that's possible. But then why is the United States constantly destabilizing governments in Latin America, which it does over and over and over again? It has staged so many coups in Latin America. It has overthrown so many governments. It's right now continually trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela, right? So what do they think is going to happen? Clearly, it's creating hundreds of thousands of refugees who are trying to escape from a situation that has been made intolerable because of the United States. It's completely contradictory, right? So helping people understand that is really important. Another really important point, and this is one that there's been some good movement recently, folks, which is exciting, which is bridging the economic and ecological divide. And what do I mean by this? Well, folks, for years, if you were an environmentalist and you would say something like, for instance, in Hamilton used to have really horrible air quality. It's still not the best, but it's way better than it used to be. And so environmental groups used to go to Stelco and Dofasco, 2 big steel companies, and they used to say, listen, you've got to put scrubbers on your smokestacks. There's technology out there where you can drastically reduce the amount of pollution you're putting out, right? And Stelco and Dofasco would always come back and be like, oh, well, that's going to cost money. Well, if it costs money, maybe we're going to have to lay some people off. Or maybe if it costs too much money, maybe we're going to move our steel mills somewhere else, right? And trust me, folks, nothing would freeze an environmental initiative faster than the company threatening, well, we'll just leave it, right? And this used to happen over and over and over again. And it was completely shady and scummy on behalf of the corporation, but it was effective. So the whole idea was, folks, you can either have a clean environment or a good economy. This is how business used to fight this battle, and they used to win over and over again. Very frustrating. However, today, there's ways in which people now are talking about the environment that are a lot smarter. They're instead saying, okay, you'll hear this language in the States a lot, a Green New Deal. And the New Deal is referencing what happened in the 1940s, pretty much. Late 1930s, 1940s in the United States. The New Deal was where FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ran on this platform of actually helping poor people in the United States by building all of these big public infrastructure projects and by, investing money in people and in communities and whatnot. That's what the New Deal was called. And it was hugely popular. It really helped build up the US economy just before and just after World War II. And so people are saying, okay, we need a Green New Deal. And what they're basically saying is we need to transition all of this infrastructure away from fossil fuels towards renewables. That's tons of work. So let's create a huge program. Let's hire a ton of people and let's actually make this transition. So it's brilliant because they're like, what's it going to do? Create a ton of jobs and we're going to help the environment, right? It's very, very cool. Another way it's messaged is a just transition, which means that we've got to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but let's do it in a just way such that you're not saying to the workers in the fossil fuel industry, sucks to be you, you're out of a job. Instead, you're saying to those industries, let's transition that workforce away from fossil fuels and towards working on renewable energy projects, right? Because doing it that way, then you actually can get those workers on side. Because otherwise, you just got to think, folks, from a logical perspective. If you're working in an oil field, you're going to be like, screw you, environmentalists. I don't want to hear your nonsense about green energy, right? Because I'm going to lose my job and I'm going to lose my home and my family's going to be out on the street, right? However, if you're an environmentalist and you're like, listen, I hear you. This whole thing shouldn't fall on your back. Instead, let's all get together and let's pressure the government and corporations to do a just transition. So it's a transition with justice in the sense that you're not going to lose your job. You're going to get retrained and you're going to install solar panels or something like that, right? So that's very, very possible that can happen. Sorry, I just want to read this one comment. Sorry, Michelle, I'm getting to this late. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some people are saying that, Michelle. I mean, I don't think I'll be honest in terms of my understanding of what's actually going on the ground. I think there's absolutely no risk of Russia moving beyond Ukraine. In fact, I think they're not even going to take Ukraine over. I think that's just what's happening right now. I think if anything, they may try and take over those two eastern provinces that are called the Donbass. So I don't think there's any danger at all of Russia expanding beyond Ukraine. And if anything, I think they're actually close to a peace deal. But I think you'll see it will involve Russia definitely keeping Crimea and maybe a couple of the eastern provinces. But that's just my sense. But I hear you. It's a horrendous situation. Like it's just watching it happen is horrible, and innocent Ukrainians are dying. And I totally agree. But yeah, I really don't think that's something to worry about. I think the worry was more that the US would directly intervene, because then you're looking at World War III, so, but thank you for your comment. Like I said, an absolutely horrible situation. So we need education. We need to bring groups together. We also need to push back against some of the things that are happening, right? And this is where resistance is important. And so what social movements have known throughout history is that collective direct action is a very powerful tool. And this is literally where groups of people get together and they do things like, we're going to shut down this highway. We're going to shut down this railway. We're going to go on strike. We're going to block this shipment of weapons or whatever. Like, we're going to take to the streets and we're going to protest. These things are important. This is what I mean by resistance, So to prevent ecological destruction, to prevent human exploitation and oppression, to prevent war, yes, people need to get together. People need to hit the streets. And in particular, we're seeing this with regards to ecological destruction. I mean, the greatest, most intense resistance against pipelines right now and against the expansion of the fossil fuel industry are coming from native activists and environmental activists who are literally blocking construction, putting their bodies on the line. Just like what's happening as well out in BC around the logging of the last of their old growth forests. You have people literally, putting themselves on the line to block these logging companies. It's incredible. It's risky. It's not for everyone, but it is important, and what's also really interesting about resistance too, is it has a profound impact on anyone w's participates in it. So I don't know if people can relate to this or not, if anyone's ever been to a protest or a march or something like that, but it's like a transformative experience. You really get the sense of like, wow, this is cool. There's a lot of people that feel the same way. This feels positive. A lot of times if you're worried about a certain issue, it can feel really lonely. It can feel disempowering. It can feel like you're a lone voice, maybe the only person who cares about racial equity or trans rights or peace or whatever. But all of a sudden, when you're standing with 1,000 people or 10 or 20 or 50 or 100,000 people that feel the same way, it's pretty powerful, right? So it can also make people really feel like, no, wait a second, this is important. This is something we need to do. And resistance also builds solidarity and democratic power. So some of the best protests are where you have literally all these different groups that come together, and they all coordinate together and they all march together and they all talk together while they're doing it. And it builds that, remember that previous thing I talked about, solidarity building, it really helps to do that. And it becomes a very powerful way of doing that. But also it becomes a powerful way of just getting things done, right? And this is where, folks, I've got to be real. I have my differences with the truckers that were in Ottawa. I think in ways I have some serious criticisms, but let's be honest. Of course, they had an impact on the government changing their COVID restrictions. Of course, the government will never admit that, but no government admits that they were forced to do something that they otherwise didn't want to do. Direct action gets it done. It really does in a lot of cases. If a whole bunch of people take to the streets, it's kind of like letting the government and the forces in control know that if you keep pushing, things are going to get intense, right? And you're not going to be able to run. It won't be business as usual, right? So resistance is very, very important. We have to resist the negative effects of this current system, this death system, which leads to social unrest and ecological collapse. And because what resistance does is it increases the cost of destructive or oppressive behavior. So this is kind of what I was referring to when I was talking about the residential schools in Canada. While Canadians, non-native Canadians didn't know that much about it, while it wasn't in their face, natives were too small a population, right? Their protest alone wasn't costly enough for the government to really act on it. But when all of a sudden it becomes a national issue, a national disgrace, where literally media all over the world is like, whoa, what's up with Canada, right? Then you start seeing massive marches. You start seeing statues get taken down across the country. Again, I know this is controversial for some people, but folks, that's when you start seeing movement. That's when you start seeing governments be like, oh, geez, we better take this seriously, right? Like what's going to get torn down next? My home sort of thing like that. Like, I hate to say it, but sometimes it takes that. And also, direct resistance shames and delegitimizes governments and corporations. So it exacts a social cost on, negative behaviors. And an amazing example of this last year was the Indian farmers' protest, right? Which, swept across the entire country. And it was unbelievable what these farmers were able to do. I mean, they stood up against violence, like horrible weather, like risks of starvation, and you name it. Like, amazing to face down these agricultural policy changes that the Modi government was trying to make. And these agricultural policy changes would have further privatized the agricultural agriculture market in India. It would have benefited large farmers over small farmers. And small farmers aren't stupid. They knew that they had to stand up against these changes, and they did, and it was incredible. And it actually, it worked, right? Modi backed off on the worst changes. It took a year, and it took, I think it was something like 700 people died in farmers in that protest. Like, it was unbelievable the amount of just tenacity and determination that was shown by the farmers. It was amazing. So, you know, it delegitimizes governments. It exacts expense and cost to operations, right? And all these things are really important. And it's partly as well what happens when a union organizes too, right? You know, for instance, there was a big strike at the John Deere Corporation in the United States a couple months ago. John Deere makes tractors, right, and farm equipment. They're a big company. And they were totally like, their workers were getting, you know, just horrible wages, you know, no benefits and whatnot. The company was totally stonewalling them, basically being like, no, we're not going to give you anything. We're not going to negotiate. And so the workers went on strike, and they won huge concessions from their employer. It's why right now in the United States, there's all of these attempts to organize unions at Amazon warehouses, at Walmarts, because these are places where more and more people are working, and the conditions are horrible. I mean, you know, at Amazon, sure, you might be making a bit more than minimum wage, but the conditions you're working under are horrendous. I mean, you can't take breaks. You can barely go to the bathroom. Like, it's just really horrible. And so resistance, and again, direct action, is organizing unions, going on strikes. Like, these things are also ways in which people force change, right? So it's really important. So I think what I'll do is leave off here, because the last category of alternatives building, I deal with a lot more in the next lecture. Alternatives building is literally about creating new structures, new government structures, new social institutions that are going to embody sustainability and equality and democracy and freedom and all that good stuff that we want to move our societies towards. So I'll leave that to the next lecture. So that's it for today. And like I said, folks, I want to reiterate that next Friday's lecture is going to be at the usual time, and I will send an email out to that effect as well, so that hopefully there's minimal confusion that way, and hopefully we also get a number of people that are able to turn up there. The other thing I'll say too is that essays will be marked. I'm working on them right now, so expect those early next week. Projects by the end of the week. So by the end of next week, you'll have all those marks, and you'll know where you stand before the final. And I'll also be getting out the review as well next week for the final. And the final is on Wednesday, April 13th. So, and you'll have the, you know, the full day again from 11 to 11 to write it. So that's all I can think of. Does anyone have any questions about anything? No. All right. Well, it was good to virtually see everyone. Yep. Thank you, Sarah. Take care, folks. Have a good rest of your day. Have a great weekend. It's not snowing right now, so that's something. Let's hope it continues to not snow. All right. Take care, folks.